We're going to start this course with a focus on the different types of tissue. And this mini lecture in particular focuses on connective and epithelial tissue. And our goal here is just to provide an overview of these tissue types. So connective tissues include tendons. We'll consider the other examples. Whereas epithelial tissues provide membranes that serve as barriers between the external environment and your internal physiology. Beyond our consideration of epithelial cells and how they work, that's going to go beyond this lecture, and we're going to consider transport in the next lecture. Beyond that, then we'll consider how neurons work, and then finally how muscles work. And so these four tissue types are organized by the amount of time that we spend on each one of them. So we're only going to talk about connective tissue in detail in this lecture. Then we'll spend a little bit more time on epithelia, more time on nervous tissue, and then finally the most time on muscles. And so for this lecture, the question is, what are connective tissue and epithelial tissues? And we're just going to march through the different types of connective tissue and describe what unites the different examples, the different kinds of connective tissue. And then we're going to consider the major functions of epithelial cells and where you find them in the body. Okay, so connective tissue. First of all, we have this example of loose connective tissue, which we find around the blood vessels and the interior organs. And this histology is a staining and slicing of blocks of tissue. It allows us to visualize the constituent materials that compose a tissue type. And what we see here are these threads. Those are collagen fibers. Now, collagen is a stiff, elastic protein among connective tissue. Certainly, it's the most common. You can think of them as functioning like rubber bands or springs in the body. They provide some elasticity to that tissue. And among or around those elastic proteins are a ground substance. So in the case of this loose connective tissue, that ground substance you can think of having like a gel-like, a gelatinous property, kind of a squishy material, but it provides some shock absorption and some structural integrity around the collagen fibers. Now together, the ground substance and the fibers in connective tissue are referred to as the matrix. And the other major component here are the cells, and the cells produce matrix. They might break it down and reconstitute it. They're the sort of maintainers of the connective tissue. Now, most of what we'll talk about for the other types of tissue, that is muscle cells, neurons, and epithelial tissue, well, we're going to talk largely about what happens in the interior of cells. That is, what is it about those different kinds of cells, or the cells that compose those different kinds of tissues? What is it about those cells that give them the special properties that they possess? Whereas in connective tissue, it is largely about what happens outside of the cells, this extracellular matrix. And its variable properties are what's interesting about the connective tissue. And so the cells play this role in building and reconstituting the matrix. Okay, so that's loose connective tissue. Then we move on, and I'm going to sort of go in increasing sort of stiffness of the material. So beyond the loose connective tissue, we have cartilage. So cartilage has a more stiff property. It's elastic tissue that also provides shock absorption. So the discs in between your vertebrae are composed of cartilage. Your nose and your ears have cartilage. Okay, so there you can sort of push around your ears, pull on it. There's definitely some compliance. But then they return back to their shape. Okay, that's by virtue of their elastic properties that's provided by some collagen fibers. And so here we have the matrix that we see, and then there's an loose assortment of cells that again maintain that matrix. So in the case of cartilage, those are called chondrocytes. With each of these examples of connective tissue, the cells have a different name, but we can think of them all as sort of functioning to maintain the matrix. Okay, beyond this kind of rubbery material provided by cartilage, we have really springy material provided by the tendons and the ligaments. Okay, so they're largely composed of these collagen fibers that we can see as these squiggly lines in this histological section. This is a histological slice of a tendon. So you can imagine on the right-hand side, there's a muscle. On the left-hand side, it's connecting to a bone. And by having this springy tendon in between, when the muscle generates tension, it can store some of that energy elastically in the tendon. And this is really important in human locomotion. When your foot hits the ground, your Achilles tendon stretches, and then that energy, which is stored elastically in the springy tendon, is then returned as that tendon recoils on the other half of a stride as you propel yourself from the ground and forwards. So tendons and ligaments that are the connective tissue that go bone to bone instead of bone to muscle. They transmit forces, they stabilize joints, and the tendons are connecting the muscles to the bones. Okay, so they have a really important function in the body, these tendons and ligaments. There are also cells that maintain this tissue. This is living tissue. Those cells are called fibroblasts. Okay, really important and more springy than what you have in the case of cartilage. So cartilage has some elastic properties, but it largely functions as a shock absorber with some structural integrity. Then we move on to a very stiff material, and that is bone. So bones obviously provide structural support, that's what we think of, but they also protect the organs, and they serve to transmit force. Okay, if you only had muscles, you wouldn't really be able to move anywhere. That muscle is transmitted, or the tension generated by the muscles is transmitted through the skeleton. So the skeleton is really important in that force transmission function. And what we have here is a matrix that provides the rigidity of bones. Okay, so it includes calcium phosphate crystals. Okay, that's the ground substance that we have in the case of bones. And there are also cells, I'm not quite sure where they are in this slice, but trust me, bone is a living tissue. It has cells that also build, reshape, and maintain the matrix. Those cells happen to be called chondrocytes, but again, similar function from the other types of connective tissue. Another key physiological connective tissue is fat, adipose tissue, which stores energy as fat. We also have fat that cushion and insulate the body. Most of what we see here is it looks like open space, but these are actually lipid globules that are inside of the cells. So that sort of purple lining that are around those blobs of lipids, so right there, is the cellular membrane, and the thickening of that section there is where you find the nucleus. So here we have a couple of nuclei that are highlighted. So fat tissue has that energy stored in the form of lipids inside of the cells. Next up, we have blood. Okay, so blood is a connective tissue. It's composed of plasma. The plasma is a ground substance. It just happens to be a liquid ground substance. And in that liquid, we find the red and the white blood cells and the platelets that form blood. Okay, so the space in this section is the plasma, and what we see here are a bunch of red blood cells. All right, so we have a variety of connective tissue types. By the way, if you're taking this course, I don't want you to go home and memorize all of these things on flashcards, but you should be familiar with these. If I ask you what type of tissue is a bone, you would say connective tissue. And I also want you to recognize the similarity among these different kinds of connective tissues. So for example, here we have a schematic of the loose connective tissue that I just described. And what we see is that there's a ground substance and fibers. Now recall that the ground substance and fibers together you call the matrix. And that matrix is maintained by the cells, which are highlighted in red. Okay, now in the case of loose connective tissue, the ground substance is like a gel that's reinforced with collagen fibers. And we consider cartilage. You can just imagine more reinforcement, more collagen fibers. The gel is stiff in the case of cartilage. Whereas in the case of tendons and ligaments, what we find is the fibers tend to be oriented in the direction of tension. That is, they're aligned with the muscle fibers so that as the fibers shorten, they pull on these springs of collagen. Okay. Now, this term structural popped up here because all of these different types of tissues we can think of as functioning in their mechanical capacity in the body. And finally, we have bone, which is the most rigid. Okay, so the ground substance in the case of bone is crystallized and very stiff. And we can contrast these structural connective tissues with what I'm calling the physiological connective tissue. So blood, which is a liquid ground substance suspended with those cells for transport. And then we have adipose tissue, which is a way of storing chemical energy. This is sort of long-term storage for energy in the body. So the cells are packed with lipids for energy storage. Okay, so those are the types of connective tissues. These schematics show the same basic parts, just organized in a very different way in the different types. All right, now let's transition to epithelia. As I mentioned, epithelia function to provide a barrier between the interior of your body and the external environment. And you can think first of skin. Okay, so here we have a histological section of skin, and it's illustrating the protective role that epithelial play. Okay, and this is not just a function of all epithelia, but this is a category of epithelial tissue. Okay. Protective epithelial tissue has many layers that provide a structural and chemical barrier. Okay, so you have some mixture of living and dead cells that are most superficial in your skin, and then when you get into the depths, those are all cells there. They're all living cells, and together those layers provide the epithelial membrane in your skin. Okay, of course, we need nutrients from the world. We need gases to dissolve. We need oxygen in particular to dissolve into the blood. And so we don't always want our epithelia to provide an impenetrable barrier. We want some exchange with the environment. And so we have exchange epithelial cells. So these are really thin cells. So here it's shown schematically, but if you have a histological section, it would look something like this, where the nucleus is the fat part of the cell, and then we can see the rest of it is really thin. And in fact, these cells not only can be a thin barrier, but you can have spaces between them. Okay, those are known as pores. And pores allow for even more exchange. So these exchange cells are all about allowing exchange with the environment. In this case, we have exchange cells that are providing the lining for a capillary. Okay, that's called the endothelial lining. So we have blood up here in pink. And then here's that space outside of the cell. Okay, that's known as interstitial fluid. And that pore and the thin layer of the thin thickness of the endothelial capillary, or the capillary epithelium, allow for a lot of exchange. Okay, next up we have a situation. So, and what I should say is that you find these kinds of cells in sites where all that the pores are providing is filtration of size. So really large proteins, for example, can't fit through the pores, but everything else can. Okay, so that's a very sort of not selective barrier. A much more selective situation occurs in digestive epithelia, where we have transport membranes. Okay, so again, this is another single cell layer, and it's controlling the movement of molecules from the external world into the interior. And in particular, we have the top surface or the apical surface of the cells with a variety of transport proteins that control the molecules that are going to make it from the interior of the gut lumen across the cell into the inside of the body through the interstitial fluid. We'll talk in the next lectures about how that works, and then we're going to talk in greater detail when we consider the digestive system. Next up are secretory cells. So there are dedicated epithelial cells that secrete chemicals such as mucus. So in your mouth you have a variety of these goblet type cells which are mucus secreting. There are other secretory cells that are focused on secreting hormones, secreting enzymes. So, for example, when you eat a cracker, then you have glands that secrete amylase that start to digest large carbohydrates and breaking them down into simple sugars. Even before you swallow the cracker, you have those enzymes at work. So, secretory epithelial cells are important as well. And then finally, we have ciliated epithelial cells. Okay, so the apical surfaces of these cells have cilia, and they beat for bulk transport of particles. So, for example, through your trachea, through your your respiratory tract, you have ciliated cells that remove or transport particles from the interior of your lungs out towards your mouth. So, if you breathe in a bunch of dust or smoke, heaven forbid, then those ciliated cells are working to get rid of those substances to keep from blocking your air passages. All right, so where do you find all of these different types of epithelia? So your body is like this sac, and this sac has, it's surrounded by skin, and so that's providing a protective membrane. In the interface between your lungs and your circulatory system, we have exchange cells. And we'll consider, when we talk about the respiratory system, we'll consider how those cells work in detail. We have a transport epithelia in the digestive system, really mostly in the absorption. So I've pointed at the stomach here. That's supposed to be the stomach right here, but it really should be focused on the small intestine down below. We have a variety of secretory cells that are secreting chemicals such as mucus and hormones in the respiratory system, the digestive system, etc. And then finally, we have those ciliated cells that function for bulk transport. Okay, so that concludes an overview of connective and epithelial tissues. And next up, we'll consider in detail how those transport epithelia work. And then beyond that, we'll consider the other two types, the muscles and the neurons, and how they function as well.